instructor at Frostburg State University in Frostburg, Maryland, and the board of directors from the Flute New Music Consortium asked me if I would do a composer interview. So today I have the honor to introduce Toronto-based composer and winner of the 2015 Flute New Music Consortium Composition Competition of newly composed music category, Bekah Sims. Hi, Bekah.
Hi, Keith.
It's great to have you. And just so everybody knows, this isn't our first chat, but we're going to pretend it is. So the first thing I'd like to do is ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am a composer, like you said, based in Toronto. I am originally from the east coast of Canada, from a little island called Newfoundland, which is the most easterly point in the continent. So I might be a little bit... I am a doctoral student at the University of Toronto. I was a flutist in a former life, that former life being my undergraduate degree. And I write a lot, mostly chamber music, and then some orchestral and wind ensemble work as well. I consider myself a bit of an emerging composer because my style is still evolving and changing. But I have a couple of things that I very much enjoy doing and continue to return to, such as music that features the flute.
Wonderful. And as a flutist, I am glad that you enjoy that. So I've read through your bio, and a couple items that I wanted to bring up. It says in your bio that you have a simultaneous fascination with terror, and I typed that wrong. So let me pull off the bio and make it a little bit clearer. You have a simultaneous fascination and terror of the universe.
That's true. Well, I've always been fascinated with the very big and the very small. So things like the unfathomable subatomic dances, the pillars of the Bekahs in a stellar nursery that might be bigger than our entire solar system. And while I enjoy reading and learning about sort of the micro and macro worlds all around us, I find that the sheer scope can be pretty mind-boggling on an existential level. So occasionally I'll feel this sort of inner terror at the fragility of being sort of in the middle of the cosmic scale. To exist so fleetingly can be pretty scary to ruminate on, and I find that type of anxiety actually propels me to create because it makes me feel like I exist for real.
Very cool. And that kind of makes my head hurt a little bit to think about that, but I get it. I totally get it. The other thing your bio mentioned, that you have an interest in the interaction of acoustic instruments and the human voice. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I very much enjoy integrating spoken word as well as what I call sounding timbres into instrumental music. Things like gasps, murmurs, breathing sounds, aspirated phonetic fragments, things like that. And part of what I enjoy about that is the sort of, besides the sonic result, is the psychological effect that it has on a performer and how it presents to a performer. Performers are trained to play their instruments, but they're not necessarily trained in how to do dramatic presentation outside of their instrument. And I think the extra energy that's required from performers to do this type of music, it sort of translates into a unique performance style.
Excellent. Well, and I know as a teacher, getting the students to really step out of the box is sometimes like pulling teeth. So
it can be difficult, and to be honest, when you write something like this, you probably should know your performers because are pretty resistant to the idea of stepping outside of their instrument, which is fair. But I know as a composer, getting people to step outside is what I'm interested in. I mean, I like to push buttons, and I like to get people thinking, where's that sound coming from? And finding the right performers that enjoy that sort of thing, it ends up being like a really lovely collaboration.
Very cool. Would you discuss your experiences as a composer? How did you get started? What was your first composition?
So I grew up in like a fairly musical family. In Newfoundland, there's a lot of traditional Irish music that happens. But for me, my personal sort of musical tastes were not very traditional in terms of where I was from. I was really into heavy metal music. I'm sort of less into it now, although I have some guilty pleasures, of course. And a lot of the heavy metal music that I listened to had sort of like fantasy themes, like Lord of the Rings. And so some of them would have like flute solos in them and stuff, which I thought was like really fantastic. And so what I would do as a young flutist, I would write extra flute solos for these pieces that didn't have them. And then I would put on the CD, because we still listened to CDs back then. I would press play and then play along my imaginary flute solo to these tracks. And then eventually I would write for flute solo and then flute duo. And I eventually got more and more flutes before then transitioning into pieces for instruments that I didn't play, which is mostly what I do now.
Very cool. Very cool. Your winning composition, A Relic of Adolescent Heat, for flute, cello, and piano. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what your inspiration was?
Well, I actually wrote this piece when I was falling in love with my current partner. Honestly, I experienced a bit of a dearth of meaningful, exciting romantic relationships sort of a couple years prior. The last part of my undergrad and my master's degree were kind of, a little boring on that front. And I had sort of forgotten what it felt like to really long for somebody. And in fact, I had ascribed those types of feelings to something that you just experienced when you were an adolescent. I just thought that they didn't exist beyond being a teenager, a la Romeo and Juliet. But it was really welcome when they came back, the return of these feelings. And that's sort of what I was thinking about when I wrote the piece.
It's kind of like the spring thaw. It's a welcome surprise.
Exactly.
Excellent. So you had already mentioned your beginnings as a composer. Who or what inspires you or continues to inspire you currently?
It really depends on the piece, because I always do score study for a specific ensemble when I'm writing something. Composers that I return to time and time again, people like Xenakis or Kaya Sariaho. But recently, actually, my favorite composer, I think, is the late, great Fausto Romatelli, who was an Italian composer. He died in his early 40s at the beginning of this century. And he was sort of poised, I think, to become a really big figure of European new art music. But, his life was tragically cut short. But what he has put out there is this fascinating mix of spectralism and psychedelic rock. So it's, influenced by drug trips, but it'll be 12 musicians playing this almost impossibly difficult music, and there'll be an electric guitar in the background. And because I come from sort of a rock and metal popular music listening background, this combination, I just thought, this is amazing. People need to hear, and so whenever I get free time, I'll throw on a Romatelli tune.
Excellent. Any other composers or that inspired you early on, or that we should keep an eye on, in your opinion?
New music composers? I mean, when I was first listening to classical music, my favorite composers were Bartók and Shostakovich. But I mean, I still love their music, but now I try and pay attention to composers that are living and writing now. There are a lot of really great Canadian composers, actually. Emily LaBelle, Anna Hussman, Jason Dole, Andrew Sandland. They're all writing music. Derek Chark, who teaches at Acadia University, is a flutist. He writes some really interesting stuff. In general, I don't find it difficult to find composers who are writing interesting things. And I think composers sometimes are a little bit introverted and have difficulty sort of doing the self, which is too bad, because then sometimes you don't get to hear some really fascinating stuff that's being written.
Well, and on the flip side of that, which is a good segue to the next question, as an introverted composer, what is your experience as an entrepreneur? I mean, there has to be some bit of self-promotion and self-preservation in the current trend for arts, at least this side of the border.
It's true. I'm actually very lucky because I'm not introverted, but I'm speaking for many of my colleagues who I know are not as extroverted as myself. I think being sort of the master of your own destiny from a musical sense is really important. I could definitely sit back and wait for people to approach me to write pieces for them, and that does happen, but I would be writing maybe 3 pieces a year, as opposed to I write 6 or 7 a year now. And part of what has gotten me writing more for what I really want to write is I created a composers collective here in Toronto with a colleague and friend of mine, Alex King, that's called Caution Tape Sound Collective. And when you are the artistic director of your sort of group or whatever you're doing, it's extremely artistically fulfilling because you're doing the programming, you choose what is being presented. And for me, I wanted to present music in Toronto that was sort of skirting the boundaries between maybe more sound art stuff and then contemporary classical. So like a mix of the two. So our pieces that we present, they could have theatrics, and most of the time they're extremely virtuosic. And a lot of times with new music groups, there's not a whole lot of rehearsal time. And so we sort of created a space where the instrumentalists are really able to woodshed these pieces and put off concerts of like music very high quality for emerging composers too. And I'm largely responsible for the instrumentation. So for example, for the second concert, I was like, let's form like a really weird quartet that doesn't have any repertoire. And so we ended up with a quartet of cello, piano, percussion, and accordion. And the end result was these fantastic pieces, and you hope that they'll live on. And when you're an arts presenter, you can kind of be responsible for helping them live on, as well as supporting the people in your community. So I found the biggest help, apart from other presenters who were extremely generous with their time and how they set up their organizations, were the arts councils. So in Canada, we have extremely gracious and generous arts councils that were recently sort of injected full of money by our new Liberal government. And in Toronto, for example, we have a municipal arts council of Toronto, a provincial of Ontario, and then a federal. So if you can secure 3 levels of funding, you can put on very large shows. You can fly over fantastic artists that can connect with Canadians. Really, they are your like best supporters. And I think when we got our grant for our last concert, they had received 60 applications for grants, and they granted about 33. So it was over half of the people's projects ended up being supported. Obviously, when you're sending in these types of things, you have to have some support material. And if you've never done a concert before, it's hard to have support material. So most of the time for like that very first show, you kind of have to put your money on the line a little bit, take a little bit of a risk. But if it's something that you feel really strongly about, it can end up having, a big reward. After that first concert, myself and August, we made all of our money back at ticket sales somehow. And then for our second concert, we had all these great programs and posters. And then we're hoping to continually be funded by different arts councils from now on. So.
Marvelous. And when we chatted before, I actually neglected to mention that we're very lucky here in the Cumberland-Frostburg area that we do have a pretty active arts council, not to the magnitude or the level that you're discussing, but they do support a lot of smaller local productions in theater and help with advertising. So we do have a little bit of that. And even in this small community, we have a Baroque ensemble. So, who knew in the mountains of Maryland when I moved here that there would be that kind of opportunity. So, you just never know. I guess you just have to get out there and find out what organizations are supporting your endeavor.
It's true, and it's easier in Canada where our population is so much smaller. Our new music sort of community is, I feel like I know almost everybody. Like if there's a name that pops up, I'm like, who is that person? They're writing music and I don't know their name. It's like sort of like a bizarre situation. And I think because it's so small, it's extremely supportive. And I think it's like, obviously it's slightly larger in the United States, but there can't be enough said for sort of supporting your colleagues because it is a really small community, especially when you go from classical music to specifically new classical music. It gets a lot smaller, but everybody's like really creative and they're really into creative solutions. So they're like your best friends for sure.
Marvelous. Safety in numbers and support in numbers. Yeah.